Okay, I think we're live. I think my husband's going to find out.
Cool.
Apparently there's a delay, but we can start talking anyway.
So what's going on in your life, Sarah?
Oh, man. Well, I told you before we started recording, like my motivation has just been absolute shit.
Yeah.
It's the collective stress and fear. Fear has been my number one, issue with this whole thing.
Yeah.
How about you?
I'm doing okay today. I live near Prospect Park in Brooklyn, and the stay in place orders aren't so strict that they won't let you go walk around as long as you keep social distance. Mm-hmm. And so I've been going to the park every day, and it really changes this situation for me because just moving and stuff, But yeah, today I'm doing okay. But the fear thing, I hear you. I was just when it hit really hard here in New York, it was just like it was like palpable. The normal New York anxiety level was like, we're just going to turn this up, and
right.
Like one of my favorite movies is that movie where they talk about the amp going to 11.
Oh yeah.
Primal Tap? Is it?
No, Spinal Tap.
Spinal Tap. Yeah. The amp going to 11 was like, yep, we're going to
go to 11.
Turn it up to 11.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, for good reason, a lot of people died here, but and a lot of people got sick. But yeah, the fear thing, it's just, we could talk about that from a Buddhist perspective. I mean, that's one of the underlying components of our suffering is fear.
Yeah.
From a Buddhist philosophy perspective, and then of course we have these moments where just the unknown, the uncertainty, just makes our minds go wild, myself included.
Yeah. Has any particular fear been coming up for you?
Well, I actually got sick, so
right.
I think I'm pretty sure I had COVID-19 about 3 weeks ago. So I came back from a trip to Spain. Big tip off there. I was teaching in Spain, and then a few days later, I started to have subtle symptoms that were pretty mild the first week, and then got worse in the second week, and then I ended up having bilateral pneumonia. And antibiotics worked for me because it wasn't, mine wasn't a serious version of it, but a lot of fear during that because there was just nobody, we don't know what this is, and people are still trying to figure it out. And so in that unknown, it's sort of like, especially if you are sick, it's like you don't know which direction it's going to go. So it was actually quite a big teaching for me. I learned a lot about myself, mostly that I'm a cranky bastard.
As most men are when they're sick, but yeah.
Okay, that's good to know.
You're not alone.
But also just an opportunity, of course, from Buddhist practice, from the experiential space, we're always looking at this notion of life and death, because in order to have life, you have death as as the what in Western thought they might call end. In Buddhism, we don't call it an end. And then in order to have death, you have life. And so these things are, I think a lot of our framework as a human being is basically around these. It's just that we forget, and then we get caught up in the minutia. Right. But there was one day where I just couldn't believe how dysregulated my nervous system became. Because once I heard pneumonia, I was like, oh, then it's going to get worse. Like my mind starts spinning. Right.
Yeah. I've definitely had periods in this where I'm like, okay, well, Trump is the Antichrist. This is the end of times, and I've had a good life. I've done a lot. And I wish that I was like totally joking, but I've definitely felt that way. And I used to have an app. I don't remember if I told you about this or not. I can't even remember what it's called now, but it was an app that would remind you several times a day that you were going to die. And there would be
I know what you're talking about.
Quotes. Yeah. And it's oddly comforting, but then of course, like what is it?
We Croak or something like that? Or?
We Croak. Yeah. And initially I was like really getting into it. And then after a while you get desensitized to that, just like every other notification on your phone. But it was, some of those quotes were extraordinarily helpful. Just remembering like our bodies are ephemeral, and we're going to move on to the next stage, whatever that is.
Yeah. And I I think this is bringing that up very strongly collectively, whether it's conscious for some of us or unconscious.
Right.
When that gets brought up, the existential angst around that. And of course, again, I don't mean to be judgmental, just offering a perspective on our current modern cultural crisis, which is, it doesn't offer us any answers. It basically offers us hedonic, materialistic nihilism as a sort of solution, which no wonder some of us are getting so depressed, because that's a dead end road. And the truth is, it's just a thought. It's not really the reality. And of course, maybe to be more open-minded, maybe it's a possible reality, right? But even with that, it's not a fixed thing. We don't know. We know the body dies. We know that for a fact. But we don't know what the mind does. And this is where Buddhism really tends to talk about mind and body as interconnected, but also not the same thing. There's one thing I was laughing during. Sorry, I just wanted to say this because I can relate to the app thing, because you're getting it every day and then it becomes like kind of wallpaper. And I was in retreat when I was a monk. I was doing periods of long retreat, and one retreat I just decided to like write a bunch of like phrases and like put them on the wall, and sometimes people will put like pictures to remind them of suffering, so they develop compassion or whatever. And it's like that. It's like after for a day, I was like, oh, it's just so inspired, and so all of this, and then it just became literally wallpaper. And so I just decided, I don't know if that's so helpful for me anymore. Anyways.
Well, hi, Deborah. Deborah's listening right now. So I wanted to invite the people who are on the live broadcast. If you have any questions for me or for Scott, go ahead and type them in, and I'll be keeping an eye on that. But otherwise, we're just going to talk about whatever we want to talk about. So
we'll like check in on the questions here and there.
Yeah, of course.
But thanks to everyone for joining us. I just want to welcome you as well.
Thank you. And in terms of our cultural response, I can't remember what I was reading. I'm sure you're reading like every article nowadays, and they all get jumbled together. But it was something that was talking about Americans will be the worst at faring this psychologically because of our hedonistic, capitalistic culture.
And I think, they're talking about this in mainstream news, and I think mayors, like, I heard Cuomo use the word, we're all interconnected. He was giving a speech the other day, the governor of New York, Cuomo, and he was saying, we're all interconnected. I was like, I can't believe a governor is saying that. Like, that's kind of amazing. So there's like very beautiful things coming out of this. But I think a very clear recognition that our individualism, our hyper-individualism in the United States, it creates some specific problems for dealing with this. Now, again, just not to kind of go into either or thinking or speaking, there's also good things about our individualism in the United States. I always poo-poo it a lot, but I was listening to an opinion about it, and I thought, it's not like there's some thoughts and ideas that can develop out of that are unique. But in general, I think it's a very different departure for a society and a culture that again, maybe it's happened in history before, but as far as any cultures that I've read about or know about that are more can function as I hate to use a term like healthy human beings, but I mean that not as like you know what I mean, it's like happier, a little bit more well-adjusted, not having the extremes of emotions as much, but of course living life and experiencing sadness, grief, and anger. Everyone experiences those, but they find those societies are less individualistic. Is my point. They're communal. When I heard of an indigenous group that when something would come into the community, like someone offered, it was an anthropologist, and they were working. They offered a woman who was the main head of this particular village or the women's area of the village. He offered her some corn or some kind of food. And it was literally, he was offering it to her personally, but she immediately took it and distributed it to the community. So it's just like, it doesn't even come into the psyche of I. There's more of a we. And I'm working with that personally too. I'm really bad at that because I'm obviously hyper conditioned into this, hyper individualism we have here. out of that. But kind of thinking about that and noticing my mind when I'm feeling this sense of we versus this sense of I.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah,
it's a big reflection for me right now, because I think it's showing us that the coronavirus.
Absolutely. You know? And I'm trying to figure out how to say this succinctly, but I don't know if I can. But the biggest fear that's been coming up for me is it's all triggering like my childhood feeling of who's going to take care of me. And there's a big us and them happening with those of us who are following the rules and the people who are protesting and wanting to not follow the rules and being very individualistic and saying they want to get their hair cut. And I was reading Pema Chodron's last book, Welcoming the Unwelcome, and I can't remember what the phrase was, but essentially she's like, the way that you practice interconnectedness is, you know, if you start to get annoyed by someone, you say like, me too, or that's me, something like that. But goddamn, I haven't been able to practice it for the people who are protesting right now. And I think it's just because my fear is so heightened, and this really truly is a life or death situation, that it's so much harder to practice.
Yeah, I agree. And I think I've been noticing definitely more intensity of my emotions as well. And kind of like my judgment, which I'm a pretty judgy person in general, but my judgment is a little bit more enhanced. And I think part of that is this kind of unsettledness and fear that's part of this situation. And so I think each of us kind of, this is kind of, again, we can look at this as a negative, but we could also look at it as a positive, which is that I think the situation, because it's collective and it's worldwide, it's going to bring out both like the sides that we need to look at, like the you know, what maybe Jung called the unconscious. It's going to bring that out more. And of course, it's going to bring out the best in people as well. But I don't look at those two things as like one's worse than the other. For those of us who want to wake up in this life, we want that unconscious to come out, but it's really painful. Like seeing my judging mind is like, wow, I'm really an asshole. Like that's what I thought last week. You know, I was like, what's wrong with me? You know, and then it shifted to this idea of, well, how do I have compassion for this? You know, how do I shift to, because if I'm going to pretend or at least try to have compassion for others, but I can't have compassion for my own emotions and the ones I don't like, how am I ever going to have it for others? So there has to be this turning towards, and I think that's where, you know, definitely all kinds of meditation, psychology, Buddhism, all that stuff, the inner work, the tools for inner work really can be so helpful to us right now. Yeah.
And a thing about self-compassion that I just want to throw out there, I don't know if you've heard me talk about it, but on my podcast, I've been geeking out about training in this new therapy, NARM, Neuroaffective Relational Model. And I am a person who has struggled, in the NARMY. Yeah, I'm a person who struggled with chronic shame, and so self-compassion can sometimes feel like a threat. And what I've learned more deeply in my experience with NARM is it's because as a child, we want to stay attached to our caregiver no matter what. And in order to do that, often we have to shut down our own authenticity. And so essentially we get used to shaming ourselves and blaming ourselves in order to maintain that attachment. And so, you know, all of us who've experienced relational developmental trauma, which is most of us, like this can be really, really triggering of these early, deep childhood wounds right now. And sometimes self-compassion is the last thing I want to do, because it's like I almost want to punish myself, because that feels more comfortable than actually accepting the love.
Yeah, I can understand that. Yeah, I mean, my relational trauma is a little bit different. I'm trying to think on it, because it was really hard for me. I mean, and again, I think there's lots of definitions of self-compassion too.
Say more about
that out there. Well, what I really wanted to talk about tonight was like this kind of essence in Buddhism, or this, it's a term, but it really refers to a whole kind of way of understanding ourselves in the world and the world around us and others, which is in Sanskrit we call it pratitya samutpada, or in English we call it interdependence. So a lot of Buddhism functions on this notion that everything is interdependent, that everything is interconnected. It's not saying everything is one. It's a little bit different than that. It just means there's an interconnection. And I think when we start to understand compassion from the perspective of interdependence, it's a little bit of a different compassion than you find sometimes as one version of it, which is like this compassion where it's me as this independent identity who's going to offer you or myself something. And like, you know, so it becomes a doing or a job, or it becomes compassion in that way actually can be necessary and useful. I'm not saying it's not useful, but it can offer further separation. And from this perspective, further separation in any way we separate, and I'll talk about that more tonight if we get into it, leads to this disconnect from the nature of reality, which is that the nature of reality is interdependence or interdependence. Right. That everything, one of my friends who I really recommend, Elizabeth Namgyal, who's a Buddhist teacher, she says everything leans, and I really like that.
Yeah.
You know?
Oh, that's really cool.
That's a way to feel it rather than think. Go
ahead.
No. I think that was it. I think for me, it's really this notion of like learning how to have compassion for self as well as compassion for other within a larger framework of unity as opposed to separation, which we can dig more into.
And that almost makes, this isn't what you were saying, but the image that it kind of conjures up for me is essentially there's a pool of compassion, and so it's not me giving it to myself, but me kind of like drinking from this pool, and we all share in that water.
Yeah, that's a really beautiful image, I think, because often we think of things as finite when we're not in the interdependence of things. We think of it as an object. It solidifies into, you know, me and other, myself and other, subject, object, whatever it is. And then the pool seems again like some of the economic, social, cultural things we're experiencing right now. There's a mentality of scarcity. Yeah. As opposed to what compassion actually is it's actually our nature in this way that's non-dual. We talk about in the Buddhist tradition, and so then when we connect with that, it's this inexhaustible pool that can't ever exhaust because it's beyond a subject-object or a self-other experience, including like self-emotion separation, right? Right. Like if we're going to offer compassion to our own sadness or our own pain or whatever it is, there can be a separation of there where it's like, I'm going to fix you and I'm going to come in with all the tools, you know, like we were talking about before we started just chatting a little bit about how so many of us in these spaces, the fear comes and then we grasp at coping mechanisms, or more to fix what's going on. No, again, as I'm sure you probably agree, there's nothing wrong with it. We need coping mechanisms. Like they're okay. It's just here when we're talking about interdependence, when we only rely on those, we're stuck in like a problem solution mentality when actually our nature is beyond that.
Yeah, it's why I hate CBT, and I get so much shit for it. But I think there's two ways to work with anxiety. You can work with the symptoms and try to help abate symptoms, or you can work with the root cause. And, I like to work with the root cause. And I think that's the same of what you're talking about too, right? It's existential, and there's no solution for an existential crisis except death, right? So we can't fix that. We just have to learn how to take care of ourselves through that. And that's the human experience.
Totally. And I think collectively, I think COVID-19 is very interesting, the way it's kind of unfolded so far in the collective psyche, because it is something we can do about, like we can do something about it, right? At least at the moment, like people think they can. And things are, working to flatten the curve in places and stuff like that. And so then it very easily gets brought into this kind of like again, a separation of us and it,
Yeah.
of this thing that's separate from the nature of our bodies and our
Yeah.
world, that then has to be eradicated, squashed, killed, maimed. So again, like Trump got his war, basically, is what's happened, right?
Yep.
And so did we, because we can blame politicians all we want, but we also got our war, many of us. And I think it's easier to think of it as a war because there's somewhere to land where we start to feel safe.
Right.
Okay, I'm safe because there's this thing that's out there that I can end. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't do anything about it, right? We obviously need to remedy people getting sick and dying. There's no question. But the problem is there is no remedy for getting sick and dying.
Right.
From a Buddhist perspective, like if COVID-19 doesn't kill us, something else will. And from a Buddhist perspective, that's just the circle of life. That's what it is. Now, Buddhism does offer a remedy to that, but it's not what we think it is. It's not like a quick fix remedy.
Exactly.
It's not like take this pill and then you're done.
Can you talk about groundlessness in the context of this? Because that's a concept in Buddhism that I just internally really struggle to accept, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say, I was thinking, do you like rabbits?
Sure.
Because it's like a big rabbit hole here, so
okay.
So I want to make sure we don't, I don't want to take our listeners too far down it. But it relates to what we're already talking about. And it relates actually to the principle of the nature of reality, which we call shunyata in Sanskrit in Buddhism. And there's a quote just to make this more symbolic, which I really like, that goes, the bad news is you're falling through the sky without a parachute. There's no parachute. But the good news is there's no ground. So I love that quote because it really points out the existential crisis, the fear, the hope and fear of, the bad news, we're falling. So it's completely, it's scary to fall. But then when we recognize where can we find the ground of self and other, where can we find something that is independent? When we recognize that we can't, we can relax into that groundlessness. And so for a Buddhist practitioner, that's really the job of the Buddhist path. I mean, the practice and study and all that of the Buddhist path is to recognize that groundlessness, not as a negative, but a positive. But we find it not externally or materially. We find it within our mind and perception. Right. And we find it as we would call that realization. Because we have these kind of stages within Buddhism of understanding, experience, and realization. So the understanding just starts with listening and reflecting and studying the teachings and all of that. Then through that we meditate and we get moments of experience. Then those experiences get clarified, and then eventually we get stable realization. But that realization isn't something. It's actually just the shedding of this sort of notion that ourselves and others and the world is independent and permanent. But again, this is really getting into Buddhist philosophy, which I know for some people, you have to know some of these terms for it to click. But the basic point is that groundlessness, when we're fearing groundlessness, we're holding on to separation. And we're holding on to separation because that's all we've known to provide safety.
Right.
But the basic problem from a Buddhist perspective is that will not make us safe.
Right.
What it does is it makes us circle. And so that's why they call, at least, dualistic life samsara.
Samsara, yeah.
Circle, right?
Yeah. Have you heard of the fourth turning?
Ken Wilber?
I think so. And somebody how? I just randomly heard it on a podcast yesterday, and just the cycle of, I don't know, the thing that's I kind of shifted topics, sorry, but it popped into my head. But essentially they have this, what's it called, generational theory that can predict the future by looking at the past. And he 3 years ago predicted that we were going to have a crisis of magnitude. And
I don't think that's that hard.
I know it's not that hard, but I was listening to something on YouTube. If you just go into YouTube and search the fourth turning, there's a 15-minute video, and it gave me a lot of peace because it helped me recognize how cyclical humans are, and how, like, as a therapist, I know that human behavior is really predictable. And it's easy for me when I'm on the outside to look at your stuff and be like, oh yeah, I can predict X, Y, Z, and I know what's happening here. But it was really nice to be able to predict it, know that people are predicting it for the collective, and that it's continued this cycle of like destruction, and then that brings enlightenment. Because I think enlightenment was actually one of the periods that he talked about.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure that exact podcast you're talking about, or the theory, but I was just listening to you. There's this kind of, again, just going back to what we were talking about a few minutes ago. There's this notion of, I think that the predicament with hope and fear and groundlessness is there's this notion that now we can use just COVID-19 as a symbol for this, that when we end COVID-19, everything's going to be fine, right? Like it's going to be okay. And so,
no, people, no.
But, I don't want to give people, it's not about becoming depressed, too.
Right.
Like, oh, we're never going to, like, it's all shit and it's all, that's not really what it's saying.
Right.
What it's saying is like a doctor, really the message from the Buddha is like a skillful doctor saying, you're looking at the wrong disease.
Yeah.
You got to look over here at this disease, which is our tendency to solidify and grasp at permanence and independence. Right? And we have to uproot that. But the trick is we can't just uproot it conceptually. We have to uproot it directly in our experience. And meditation is one of those tools that helps us to uproot it when we use the tool of meditation for that. Meditation can also be used as a tool to keep us in the cycle. Right?
Say more about that.
Well, when meditation is used only as a self-soothing tool, we're kind of re-solidifying our sense of self.
Yeah.
Now, again, I'm not going, because I don't want to speak in either ors, because I want to try to be more clear these days that, like, it's okay to talk about a disconnect with something, but also that something could still be useful temporarily.
Yeah.
The Buddha, when you really look at the corpus of the Buddha's teachings, that's what a lot of it is. It goes from skillful means to and it grows and it expands, especially from the way we look at it from Himalayan Buddhism. We look at it as like a three journey vehicle that kind of just, it doesn't, you don't lose the first level when you go to the second or third. You take that with you, but it expands. And some of those on the first level are skillful means. So a coping strategy of using meditation to self-soothe and find a little bit of calm is not a bad coping strategy for those who just need to start there and who need that.
Right.
Some days I need that, so I do it.
Yeah.
But this when we're talking about this bigger picture of understanding interdependence, connecting, experiencing that as our nature, the habit of self-identifying, getting into another solid experience of like, okay, now I found the ground of calm, right? Can also find us. So that's more what I'm referring to around that.
I'm also mindful. I see my sweet friend Lisa here, and she's been giving us some comments. And I'm thinking about people who haven't experienced meditation at all. So can you give a little intro, little one-on-one for people who might be looking for that right now, using it as a tool? Like you said, a great place to start.
Like the first type or the second type?
Both. Both, yeah.
Yeah. Maybe I'll talk from a Buddhist perspective first, because,
Sure.
What I've realized is kind of like, just like I think a lot of us are doing right now, I'm also like really reflecting on my life and how I want to interact with my own mind, my emotions, the people around me, my relationships. And also because I do service work like you, I'm also reflecting on how I want that to come about. So one of those reflections I'm just sharing publicly now is, I think there's a lot of great mindfulness teachers and a lot of great teachers for using meditation as a coping strategy. And so for me, I'd like to focus more on the strategies around how to actually move beyond this this separation that I was talking about. Now, the coping strategies can be a step towards that.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying. We don't have to think of them as better or worse.
Yeah.
But they are different as a strategy for working with our existence, for working with self. So I'm going to start with a Buddhist perspective, which is much wider, which is meditation is an activity of getting to know our minds. And initially, when we approach it like that, and by mind here, Buddhism defines mind generally, or Mahayana Buddhism, as that which is clear and knowing. So it has this quality to perceive and experience. And then, of course, we can experience our emotions, our thoughts, our perceptions, all of that, right? And we can also experience mind's what we call mind's nature, which is its interdependence, which is its root or its actual, the essence of what freedom is in Buddhism. And so meditation is, we practice it, we practice awareness in order to get to know the mind, in order to get to know our experience, and through the practice of awareness, which is sort of the root or ground of meditation, what we're trying to do is to have deeper and deeper insights into what our nature is. And so what we start to do is separate out what is like innate to our nature and what is not innate, what's extraneous, right? Or we could say what is not self. Right? Sometimes Buddhism puts it that way, and a lot of people get confused because they think, well, does that mean there's no self? No. It's just separating out the self as an interdependent experience, or what my teacher calls the mere I, from what actually causes us suffering, which is the reified I, the I that fixes, solidifies, all of that. So Buddhist meditation is aimed at having insight into that, and eventually through experience and then direct realization, cutting the roots of the reified I, which we call the root of, that would be the root of suffering, because the reified I is what experiences afflictive emotions and acts out behaviors that ripple into our psyche and the world, right? It's just as cause and effect. So going back to just working with the mind in general, and what might be a first step for people, again, maybe using some coping strategies, is we do need a body that is regulated. We do need a nervous system that we know how to regulate. Yeah. So in Buddhism we would call this first finding a calm body, right? And this doesn't mean that then Buddhism is expecting or sort of this first step is expecting you to always be calm. That's not appropriate, actually.
Right.
If we're in the middle of the street and a car is coming, it's not going to be good for you, right? We need the adrenaline to come up. But when we get out of the way and we go to the sidewalk, we need the adrenaline to come down appropriately. We realize we're not in threat anymore. Right. And so I think, working in the beginning is what I teach a lot as sort of entrance level / I would say augmenting our hyper conceptual dominant culture is embodied awareness practices of just coming into the body, feeling, learning to be with what we're experiencing. So again, this in somatic therapies, you see very similar things, similar practices that some are borrowed from Buddhism, some are borrowed, people, coming up with new things and innovating. So I think that's that's like a first very good step of coming into the body, learning how we can just be within the body. Then from there, we can start to cultivate awareness, which is the mind that knows. It's the mind that can be that can watch, be conscious of, bear witness to our experience, be that a perceptual experience or an embodied experience, a thought, an emotion, whatever. And so through that awareness, then we can start cultivating it. And of course, one of the first teachings by the Buddha, the first meditations he gave, was on the 4 foundations of mindfulness. So we work with the first foundation of body and breath. And that's really helpful. So that's why, breathing is often the first object that's taught. Because when we're trying to get to know our mind, it's really difficult because the mind's like a monkey just jumping all over the place. So we need to tie it to something. And that's why we use an object like the breath or something. But again, I'm creating a distinction that is not just about becoming calm. That's the first stage. It's almost like, it's like the preliminary. Like when you're cooking, you heat the pan. right? But you need to put food in there, and you need to let it cook, right? So I'm an advocate for recognizing. Actually, what I really like is creating clarity around this, and then people can have an informed decision of where they're at and what they need right now, right? And I think that I like going about that way, because otherwise everything gets jumbled up and confused in this big kind of soup of kind of new age meditation stuff, which again can benefit, but it's not necessarily going to lead to the type of awakening of recognizing this greater interdependence. So
Yeah, thank you.
anyway, sorry.
No, I like it. And we actually have a question here, our friend Mihaela. So she says, I have a question related to how to cope with the rise of aggression, especially when there is a difference of opinion and or political affiliation. So I'm sure we both have interesting thoughts on this. Do you want to
unfriend them? No, I'm just
yeah, right. I know.
I don't actually.
No.
Well, I don't have a lot of people. I don't post that a lot of political things on my Facebook page, so maybe that's why I don't get a lot of conflict on that. But definitely, I post spiritual stuff, and there's conflict and conflict in conversations and things. So, I mean, again, I think it comes back to understanding our minds. And because when we understand our minds and emotions, and I don't just mean mental mind, I also mean emotions. I mean experience, where we're interested in becoming familiar with ourselves in a way that's gentle. And again, I'll use this term compassion in the wider way, where it's not just to come in and fix ourselves. Actually, we want to bear witness to our experience because we're interested in that. We're interested in being a scientist of our experience, without any preconceived idea or hypothesis, just watching. And meditation can allow us to do that. And for me personally, if I really think about it, that's really the only, maybe not the only, but that's one of the main things that's really helped me in my life when working with others, and especially people I disagree with or who are aggressive towards me or I want to be aggressive towards or whatever, is I have to start to look at this person as an expression of my mind. And not only that, obviously if we look and we come out of our self-enclosure a little bit by through awareness and compassion, we can see the person is experiencing a lot of the same things as us internally. Right? And so we start to, again, it's all about this idea of separation. We start to move out of this solidity of independent. I'm independent. You're independent. I'm right. You're wrong. And we start to see each other's humanity first.
Yeah, I was watching a video the other day about the science of how to change people's minds, and essentially the antidote is, yes, you look at the similarities and figure out what is the common goal that you share, and then talk about how the different ways to achieve that. In response to this question, I'm thinking about anger from a NARM perspective, and I'm not sure, Mihaela, if you're talking about aggression that's coming from the outside or feeling aggression from the inside out. So I'm going to talk about from the inside out, but NARM talks about primary and default emotions, and default emotions are essentially whatever your go-to is often the default, and it can be different in different situations, but I can just share, for me, what I've realized in this process is anger is really a terrifying emotion for me to feel, because that was anger was used as a weapon in my household, and so it wouldn't have been safe for me to feel it as a child, and so feeling it as an adult was threatening. And I remember after Trump got elected, watching everything and all the outrage that was happening, and I was just like, I'm just sad. And I thought at the time, I was like, oh, look how spiritually evolved I am, that I'm not feeling anger. But I was bypassing it, and I didn't even know it. And so when I'm feeling sad now, I actually have to think, am I actually angry? Is there a protest in here? And for a lot that's going on right now, I do have a lot of protest. I have, and it's tied to my feeling of safety and being okay. And so, I always say, like, feelings are always right. It's just the behavior that can be in question. So I have to be careful what I say when I'm angry, but I allow myself to feel that. And I was actually talking to a client about it today, because she was judging herself for feeling angry about something. And I was like, well, but it is a natural response to what's going on right now. And the judgment that you have about that anger is actually, like, that's the samsara, right? Like, that's creating that cycle. So, it's information. Like, that's what I try to remember. Like, okay, this is information, and what is this anger trying to tell me, and what do I want to do? How do I want to hold space for it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, and Mihaela, you were saying it comes from the outside. Yeah. Unfriend. I don't know, man. Like, a thing I've learned in 12 steps is, if I'm gonna respond to something, is it thoughtful, honest, intelligent, necessary, and kind? And if it is all 5 of those things, then I will say it. If it is not all 5 of those things, then I won't, and I just disengage, and if people are going to come at me, like, I just unfriend. I've had to do that, unfortunately, and not everybody is going to be interested in communicating from a heartful place, like I know, Mihaela, you do, and I try to do. So that's just, that sucks.
What do we do though when it's a family member and we can't unfriend the family member?
Well, you know what? That's the thing that people are really struggling with right now. Calls to domestic violence hotlines have gone up exponentially. There's a true threat for a lot of people right now, and so I don't want to minimize any of that. If anybody out there is going through it, I feel. I don't have an answer for it, because I think every situation is different, but I feel like you said earlier, this is bringing a lot to the surface, and I am hopeful for people who are in relationships that are harmful to them, whether it be a family member or a spouse or a partner, that they find the strength to leave and take care of themselves in whatever way they can. I actually had somebody reach out to me recently and say, I have to leave my partner. Do you know a place I can stay? So, yeah.
I think this is where spirituality can get really confusing, because some people get very serious about their spiritual practice. They might be enacting. Now, I'm going to go into the little I know about, other psychology, not Buddhist psychology. You tell me if I'm wrong here. You're welcome to. People, they tend to act out their relational trauma, right? Yeah. If they're unaware of it. And so then the spiritual path can also, which we call, a form of spiritual bypassing. It helps them it gives them more and more reasons to enact out that relational trauma, would be keeping a state of self-diminishment and putting themselves as a doormat all the time. And then now this, idea of humbleness in Buddhism gave them a reason to keep doing that, when actually it's just reinforcing their already solidified ego, which is creating suffering.
That was my mom with Christianity. Oh yeah.
So it's super common. And I actually don't think it's like some experience that and some don't. I think we all do. Yes. And we just go through our different relational behaviors with it, and we have to bring that unconscious to the conscious and recognize it through awareness. But and that's where boundaries are just so helpful. And I think, there are often when we teach loving kindness, this in Buddhism, this practice comes out of a sutta where the Buddha, asked his monks to go back to this forest where they were being harassed by, spirits doing trickery, and to practice love for them. And I think, again, it's symbolic for the sense of like when we form gentleness and subtleties in our body and our minds, it actually does change situations. So that's also possible. But that also, for some of us, that might not be possible until healthy boundaries are put in place, right? So it's kind of like,
Well, Deborah just commented saying thank you for talking about spiritual bypass. I think we can probably talk about it more. Anything else to say about spiritual bypass?
I don't know. Like I said, I think it's inevitable, because when we're in a mode of separation and what we call marikpa in Tibetan, or like confusion or misknowing, then there's we're just going to go have to navigate through the different kinds of misunderstanding and misknowing or misperceptions we have, which are, again, there's the big one of this dualistic self and other and all that, but there's many small ones that come out because of that. And so I think spiritual bypassing is just one of those inevitable separations that we have. And what I found really helpful is, I'm thinking about this a lot these days, because one of my passions is understanding, obviously, like from my perspective as a Buddhist teacher, I'm really interested in there's benefit to having a 2,600-year-old tradition. A lot of people like to point out there's major faults in having a 2,600-year-old tradition, because then you have, pre-modernism and all the negative aspects of that. But there's also positive aspects to it too. For instance, like I already named, like even 50, 100 years ago, we were much more communal people. We were much more parts of small communities. And so when I look at traditional Buddhism, they have strengths coming out of those social structures, where it's just part of practice is to relate in group, in connection with others, and not so individualistic. And so for me, things like that can be really helpful in working with spiritual bypassing, because when we make it relational and we make it about inquiry and wanting to really understand ourselves in relation to the world, in relation to others, it's see where we're bypassing a little bit easier.
Well, and if I can jump in there too, it's a survival strategy in many ways, because if the system cannot tolerate an overwhelm, I am going to shut down or bypass. And so it's not, I really like how you've been saying, like, okay, we're not going to talk about things as like good or bad or black and white, because it's all a survival strategy and helping us cope as best we can.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's a really good point, because I think it is about mechanisms of safety. Like in Buddhism, one of the first things we do when we formally enter the Buddhist path is we take refuge. In symbolically, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, in the religious aspects of it. But really what this is pointing to is a shelter, a refuge, a form of safety, where we're shifting our idea of where we normally seek safety, and we're recognizing or aspiring to seek safety actually ultimately in this nature of interdependence as a realization. That's where actual safety, actually interdependence at its most subtle nature of shunyata, it goes beyond safe or not safe. So that's why it's safe. Not to get too confusing. But then, as you pointed out, which I think is really skillful in how we avoid the bypass, is, we do have these relational patterns of where we've sought safety that were, for a lot of us, and I can just look at my life, were formed very early on, and so just thinking we can get those right away is not that intelligent. Right? Because we need those, and we can recognize, this is not actually keeping me safe. As we develop more awareness and insight, we can see, okay, like for instance, my anger doesn't keep me safe. It probably is the opposite. But I still get angry, so I have to find room to work with that and not bypass the anger, to feel the anger, because to me, compassion is really feeling an experience, bearing witness to it, being with it, right? Allowing. But doing that in ways that we can also feel safe in that moment, and then that'll expand. It's like, I think our platform of safety changes and it upgrades, and then eventually true realization in Buddhism, awakening, they would say, is like, you've transcended the need for safety in the dualistic sense of what that is. But again, we're talking about something transhuman, just to be clear here. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Well, we've got about 11 minutes left, and no more questions, but at least not yet. But I'm just thinking we've kind of tiptoed a little around this, but didn't say it directly. The reason that we're not giving practices to help people like cope right now. Do you want to say a bit more about that?
Oh, I just thought it was
that's it.
Your fault.
We're just not. We suck.
No. Well, like what we talked about before we started the call, which was, we were kind of like jabbering a little bit, and then we both like hit on this thing of like recognizing that there's so much of a push right now. I mean, we already talked about this, but there's so much of a push right now to be like, okay, you need this? Great, we got this for you. You know, need this? Great, we got this. And again, I don't mean to be too sarcastic, because that's helpful to us. We need some of that, right? Just to get through the day. And I realize a lot of you out there, there's just no way some of us can deal without that. But if we're constantly relying on that, we're a little bit, it's not that different than just sort of someone giving us this condition of a pill, and then we're right back in the same place the next day where we need another pill.
Yep.
So I think, you know, what we really want, you know, sharing with you earlier, what we really wanted to focus on was like the bigger picture of like, yes, we need coping strategies in the short term, but trying to challenge ourselves to understand the bigger picture and to actually just seek out places where we can learn more about this. So for me, it's like Buddhism, especially, it takes a lot of framework to actually be able to practice it. But it's like we have no choice but to learn a little bit of framework and then practice from where we are.
Yeah.
And then from that, it'll develop, and we'll learn more framework, and we'll practice that. And so the experience, understanding develops like kind of like that. And so, but yeah, I think I have a strong allergy these days. I mean, when I work with people one-to-one, I'm definitely giving people strategies to work with anxiety and these things, because it's just necessary, you know? I need it too. But if we kind of stay in this paradigm, we're kind of stuck on a wheel, you know? And so I actually think that's the larger bypass that's happening, you know? The talked about spiritual bypass. And again, I have nothing, the secular meditation movements are wonderful. There's a lot of benefit people are getting from them, but they're also when they're highly commodified, they're selling,
right?
Like they're selling something that actually, I don't know how to put it. It's like they're selling a very conditioned experience of practice and meditation.
It's like manualized.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, okay, just turn this app on and everything's going to be fine.
Right.
But I heard a Tibetan teacher talking about this the other day. But an app actually can't make us happy. It just can't.
Yeah.
And so that's the sad truth. And so we look to the app. So it's not really like there's a fault with using an app or whatever. But the problem is the vantage point from how we're looking at it. Because we're looking at this conditioned thing to save us. But no one and nothing can save us.
Right.
It might give us a tool to have more insight. And that's beneficial. As a Buddhist teacher could, or any other spiritual, qualified spiritual teacher or a therapist, can give us insight into our mind and emotions in life. But but at the moment we treat it as a condition that's going to happiness, we end up on that wheel again, right?
Well, and I can speak to that as a therapist who has been put in the position by my clients of, you're supposed to fix my emotions, you're supposed to be the one to help me. And then when I inevitably fail to fix all the emotions, and I try to tell people I do not want to be on that pedestal, but they shove me up there anyway. But when I inevitably fail, then there's, the blaming me, and I'm like, but you've been Dorothy all along with the Wizard of Oz. You've had the power all along. Exactly. And it's just my job to kind of help you peek in and find that.
Yeah. Beautiful. As you're talking, I was just remembering stories with some of my teachers, my Tibetan Buddhist teachers. Some of the best teachings I've gotten from some of my root teachers are ignoring me. Literally ignoring me. Like not answering my questions, kind of just being like not talking to me in full sentences. And it was incredible because I was looking for validation from them, And because of their compassion, they knew what the medicine was that I needed, which was a kind of a bitter medicine, which is not feeding that validation. And eventually it clicked. I mean, after being ignored many times, it's just like, maybe there's a teaching here. Maybe they don't hate me. Maybe there's a teaching here.
Yeah.
And that started for me this interesting path of I would say real, genuine self-acceptance. and what my teacher refers to as like a sense of okayness.
And it's funny, what you're talking about is exactly the practice in NARM, where instead of the therapist giving the answer, we're really creating the space for the client's own agency to arise and to realize that, yes, I am the only one who can take care of myself. I'm the only one who can give myself this answer. That's really cool.
Yeah. And if you don't mind me adding to that, I mean, that's beautiful. But what I'm noticing and what I'm talking about lately, what I'm trying to expound on lately is we also need others for that too. But the problem is like that, you know what I'm saying? It's a subtle thing, because it's like that other isn't the validator. The other is a part of our interdependent experience. Leaning. Yeah, it's that thing that leans. And so when we deny that, we're also separated.
Right.
So for me, how to say this? We exist in each other's life to help each other awaken.
Yes.
Like if you weren't here as a part of my life, I would be that much more crippled in awakening. So to me, it's just like, it's like that. And so that has to become part of the recognition too.
Absolutely. Yep. And that's the part of NARM too. That's the relational experience, is that the therapist is holding that and holding you as well. Yeah.
Beautiful.
Well, we just have a couple minutes left, and you said you got shit you want to peddle.
Oh yeah, after all of this,
after all this like anti-capitalism, blah blah blah. Let's help Scott make money. But seriously, no. Tell us what you got.
I just mentioned what I do, and actually, maybe it's a good time to speak on this. And I don't mind speaking on it publicly, because I think we're all struggling with this of like what. As we're there's a really good article I really like called "The Coronation" by Charles Essenstein, and he mentions in there like he mentions this COVID-19 as a way we can it's like an initiation that we can transform through this if we know how to use it and we work with it, and our personal everything we've been talking about, our personal reactions and emotions and relational patterns. But at the end he says and hopefully through that we can find when we go back to normal, which everybody wants to go to this thing called normal, which I have no idea what that is. He says maybe we can go back to a more compassionate normal. And I really like that. And part of that for me is economy.
Yes.
And thinking about like how, it's really sad that we even have to promote. To me, self-promotion is an incredibly sad tool nowadays. And because someone starts doing it, the other person starts doing it, then we're all doing it, Yep. And then if you don't do it, nobody gets to connect with what you offer as a purpose. And for me personally, it's just more like, I've been really reflecting on this of like, it's really the intention of the ground where we're coming from and making sure we're not coming from a scarcity mentality. And that really is about this interconnection and relational thing of like, okay, like this is what I do in the world somewhat. And that's, evolving and changing, and then I'd like to let you know about it and to create community rather than, this kind of commodified relationship.
Yep.
And again, I don't have all the answers to that because we're still stuck with some of these economic models that I feel a little bit tricky, but it's what we got to work with,
Yep. So, that's I really like the way you said that. And it's interesting. I was listening to, Pete Holmes, he's a comedian, and Conan O'Brien was just talking about like coming up and becoming a celebrity, and how much easier it was in some ways back then, because there's a finite amount of celebrity to go around and a finite amount of ways that you could do it. And now literally anybody can be a celebrity on YouTube or Instagram. And so it's, where is it coming from? And blah, blah, blah. Anyway.
Oh, we could do a whole nother hour on that.
Yeah.
So good. But anyways, with that said, I have online retreats coming up, as well as I do a Monday night class that's donation based every Monday on Zoom from 6:30 to 8 Eastern Standard Time. It's like a meditation and a Dharma talk, and then just some discussion, Q&A group discussion. And then a day-long, an online day-long on Zoom, co-teaching with two other teachers on May 2nd. And then a weekend retreat with another co-teaching with my friend Craig on, the 15th through the 17th. So it's just opportunities where I think, I was thinking about it today, and we're kind of forced to do this more virtual world right now. But we can use it to make lemonade out of lemons. Where to me, I much prefer embodied community when I lead retreats and teach classes. But I led an online retreat a few weeks ago, and it was actually pretty cool. I'd never done a full day long online.
Yeah.
And I had the help of Craig, another co-teacher, Craig Hasse, and it went pretty good. I was surprised. So there's a couple of those coming up my Monday night, as well as if people want to sign up for my newsletter, and all that can be done on my website. If you just go to
Somebody
Scott Tusa.
Just asked.
Yeah, you could type it in there, scotttusa.com. 3 T's.
Have enough T's, exactly.
Yeah,
I think so.
And just poke around there, and you can just check out all the things and stuff, and there
it goes.
Kind of my offerings out there. So
yeah. Well, thank you. It's a joy to be in your life and help you awaken. You're welcome.
Exactly.
Awesome. Well, thank
you. Thanks
and
for
thanks everybody for joining us. We've had about 15 people this whole time, so that's nice.
Cool. Well, I want to say hi to those 15 people. Yeah. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, friends.
And thanks, Sarah. Yeah, this is awesome. Thanks for inviting and just kind of prompting this. It's really, I always enjoy talking to you, and I love your ideas and just who you are. So thank you.
Well, thank you. Same. Yeah. And the funny thing is, the last time I couldn't figure out how to end this, and I realized, there it is. Okay. All right. Bye, guys.